everybody, it's Grandmama. Time for another story from a Hometown Scrapbook by Ben Weatherwax. Today's story, Edward Thompson, Charlie Hughes. Hello there. We're going to talk about a pair of old-timers tonight. One of them was a character on the streets of Aberdeen, a little wisp of a man with a white beard who ambled along our streets for a quarter of a century, fished from the docks along the waterfront, was known to every boy in town, and who lived about as frugal and conservative an existence as an Aberdeen resident ever enjoyed. The other man knew the streets of Hoquiam when they were only lines on a map, and was probably best known not for streets at all, but for highways and byways of the vast charted waterways where sailing ships made their way. One of our characters belongs in the pages of the colorful men of the harbor history, the other character in the obscure, nearly forgotten little man who will return in retrospect to the mind of many a listener as one long departed, who looks in on us for a brief chat. So when Dick Crombie has said a few words from our sponsors, we'll be back with a pair of stories about Edward Thompson and Captain Charlie Hughes. Dick, it's your turn. It was long before Grays Harbor merchants changed the printing on their statements and receipts from 18- to 19-, and people began to argue whether the 20th century started in 1900 or 1901, that the little Scotsman with a wiry, close-clipped beard appeared in Aberdeen with an obvious intent to settle here. His name was Edward Thompson, and he was already approaching the middle age of a man's life, and he looked at the world from a good many angles. Edward Thompson had been born in Orkney Island, bleak, marrow-chilling, tweed-wearing Orkney, and when he was old enough to pull a line, he went to sea. It was close by adventure at first. He worked on a canal ship, the coastal sailors, serving a seaman's apprentice under sail before the mast. He was a slight-built man. With his youth, it was all he could do to carry his share of the crewman's chores. But what he lacked in physical abilities, he made up with Scott's persistence. He graduated to bigger schooners, and when many a lad of our time is learning to pilot a jalopy around corners on two wheels, Edward Thompson was an able seaman. Amongst his ports of call was New York City, and when he was weary of the sea, he jumped ship at that port and went on to Canada. For a number of years, he worked for the Hudson Bay Company before his wanderlust that gets into seafaring men prompted him to move on. And then, in time, in the mid-1880s, he came to Grays Harbor. He didn't waste much time once he got the feel of Grays Harbor sawdust. He promptly acquired 2 lots on the corner of 5th and I Streets in Aberdeen, and constructed himself a small 2-room house on the property. He planted fruit trees, a garden, and worried the 2 large stumps that remained on his property from the days of when what is now Aberdeen was a virgin forest of the finest timber, if they ever grew. Moreover, he found himself a job. It was sort of work that a former sailor could fit into nicely, because the janitor of the high school that stood on Terrace Heights Hill, that is, a great wooden building with its flamboyant tower and its tall windows, that was a sailor's landmark from the waterfront, and whose ample front porch the little Scotsman could survey the home he had selected spreading down to the waterfront. He was soon known to the students, and although he was not an old man when he first came here, his frugality His hermit-like existence in the small house on I Street and his stumpy beard earned him the title of Old Man Thompson. And Old Man Thompson he was until his last days among us. He walked with a seaman's gait. This quaint little man, and his proud of his dexterity, gained as a sailor before the mast. He used no ladders to prune the trees. He climbed their trunks and walked their limbs as though they were out on the yard arm beating down the sails. He was scrupulously honest, and his little cottage was pinned neat, ship-shape, and every item having a place and always kept there. He had the Scotsman's keen sense for business, and he invested in real estate, selecting each piece with an eye towards Aberdeen's development, and it was these investments that eventually proved a matter of much interest to Grays Harbor. His friends were few. He selected from the fellow Scots of the community, and although he would at times pay stiff and formal calls to discuss the turn of things in his homeland, he kept mostly to himself and fenced in his property with a board barrier that went entirely around his 2 Fifth Street lots. And with the passing of the years, he increased in his eccentricities. Children got extreme treatment from the little sailor. If he liked them, he showered them with apples and pats on the heads. If they were among the boys like Jack Rem or young George Karshner, who played baseball in the vacant lot across the alley and knocked their ball over into his garden, he roared threats at them and shook a mean-looking pitchfork at them when they vaulted their fence on the way out after retrieving their baseball. And of course, this sort of warfare was something the boys understood. After a ball game, when the little Scotsman had run a player out of his lot before the ball had been retrieved, the player of both teams would bombard the little house with rocks and sticks until he appeared with a pitchfork and squeaked roaring to send them packing down the alley. His stubby beard grew gray, then white, and he became one of the town's characters as he ambled through its streets, his hands clasped behind him, his small shoulders bent forward, his head stooped. He spent much of his time on the waterfront, which he understood better than the rest of the town, and could be found almost any sunny day fishing from the dock at Hafferty's cannery for whatever would take his bait. The fish he would wrap in newspaper and took home to clean and prepare in his own peculiar way, and the smoke of the wood fire twisting from the little brick chimney was usually the only sign of life around the small town house as Old Man Thompson gained the years that he had long enjoyed in name. And then, in 1923, death came quietly to the little man at the age of 82. And people noted with interest that one of the town's characters had moved on. But his story, why, it was just half told. Attorney A.M. Abel, who had attended to the legal matters of this little bachelor for years in Aberdeen, began to unravel the skein of his estate. It was first discovered this quiet little character who did odd jobs and chased boys with pitchforks had amassed more than $50,000 in his long life. And secondly, that he had made very firm arrangements for the disposition of his means. He had long ago lost track of his relatives, all but a brother in the East. But he had once loaned that brother money, which had never been repaid. The brother had planned to repay it, but his wife had insisted the bachelor had no use for it, and the little Scotsman never forgot. One provision of his will was that nothing was to go to that brother, his wife, or their children. So, to trace the rest of the family, it was necessary to start with the files and records on the island of Orkney. To complicate the matters, there were many relatives and many had identical names. It was found that some of their heirs could be reached through the Hudson Bay Company of Canada, which had records of everyone who ever lived in the territory served by their great firm. For a full year, the search went on for the heirs of the hermit of Fifth Street, until finally in 1924 the estate was closed. That was the year that the Aberdeen public school system acquired the Fifth Street lots where the little man had lived, and where a few years later a baseball field that had been the bane of his long and lonely life and his one-time homestead were combined as a site for Miller Junior High School that stands where the little Scotsman once pruned his orchard and chased the neighbor boys away with a pitchfork and calculated his savings and lived to become one of the most picturesque characters out of Grays Harbor's long past. And now, Dick, a few words from our sponsor. We told you that we'd have a page tonight about Captain Charlie Hughes, one of the first seagoing figures to call Grays Harbor home port, and we have turned to it. It goes back a long ways because Captain Charlie skippered the first ship ever built on Grays Harbor and counted his years afloat from 1877 when he rounded the Horn as an 18-year-old first mate on the old bark Rival. Charlie Hughes had gone to sea at 14, and he grew up under the billowing sails that he was to follow through all the years of his life. It was about 1880 that he got his first command, the schooner Rebecca, and was assigned, of all places and of all times, to the South Sea trades. And if ever a seafaring man should have known when to leave well enough alone, it was when Captain Charlie was sailing among the palm-fringed atolls and land-lugging lagoons of the South Pacific. For in the 1880s, that was indeed the paradise of his troubled old world. But Captain Charlie Hughes wanted action. He was young, with hands calloused from handling ropes and a back strong from reefing over the sails and yarns. Yes, Captain Charlie wanted action. He asked his company for another ship, thinking it might put him into other waters, and they gave him the Jesse Nickerson and sent him down to Suave. So he quit the company and went looking for something less romantic and more action in it. And he was paid a call on Captain A.M. Simpson. Now, Cap Simpson was a man behind George Emerson in the Old Northwest Mill, who was laying down a new schooner up on Grays Harbor. She was the first ship ever to be put together in this port. There were a few experienced shipfitters, and Tom McDonald had come up from Eureka to supervise and design the job. But the rest of the shipbuilding were men who had plenty of natural suave, if little of any skill that comes with years of experience. One of those was a young fellow up from the harbor named Sam Ben. He was a ship's carpenter under McDonald as the Scotsman put the schooner Pioneer together. From that day on, Captain Charlie was a Grays Harbor man. He had made port with one of his schooners, and he commanded some of the best. He was at home in the best houses and met a friend on every street corner. He did a short hitch in Alaska as superintendent for the Letteridge Company in Nome. Then he got back into deep water stuff again and mastered such familiar Grays Harbor ships as the J.M. Weatherwax and the bark Areola and the Barkington Anquarter, and a pair of more modern vessels, the American and the Henry Villard. All of them were as familiar to Grays Harbor as the Black Cats or the Southwest Storm. From 1886 to 1900, he made his home in Hoquiam and told his old friends that he always considered Grays Harbor home port, and he visited it as many times afterwards until he went to the landman's grave in 1935. Closing another story on one of Grays Harborites who went down to the sea in the saltiest days of our newness, when Grays Harbor's men were sailormen, and the sea a great front yard, to a young man from here who headed for the call of adventure, when we find him recorded in our Hometown Scrapbook. Thanks for listening.